going to be 45 minutes or an hour of hungry people staring at me. So I'm glad that's not the case. I did that once, and people seemed so frustrated the whole time. Is it me or the food? It's mostly me. So we're going to talk about Angular. This is kind of the hacker's guide to the Angular galaxy. This is the first episode. It's a really basic introduction to Angular. We'll kind of talk about some of the common terms that are associated with it, some of the pitfalls, including logic in your templates, and a bunch of other stuff. And we'll kind of prep ourselves up for a more advanced second session. So we'll get to a baseline. So how many of you guys are familiar with Angular already, or use Angular, or have used Angular? Okay, yeah, read back there. So we'll have a few bored people. That's all right. See if I don't bore all of you. So my name is Matt Krieger. You can find me on Twitter at Matt_Krieger. I first used Angular at BlackBerry. I was actually building dashboards with this guy. He handled all the server-side stuff. I did most of the client-side stuff, and he was like, you shouldn't be using this crazy new framework. And I was like, I always want to use the craziest new framework. And it turned out to be a pretty good investment of time. I learned a lot about Angular, building these data analytics dashboards. So it was a lot of like interactive charts and stuff. Although most of that Brandon is back together with jQuery. Yeah, you probably know what happened to BlackBerry in Halifax.
So that was your fault?
Yeah, that was all my fault. Yes, I saw that downfall. I brought Angular on board and look what happened. And I met this fine group of people at a hackathon that Rudy invited me to. And I joined them at coincidence, and I thought they were going to bring me on to build these dashboards and stuff. But I was pretty lucky. They said, you know, we'd like you to build this integration for Angular. And so I did, and that's kind of where my current experience comes from. It's called GoAngular. It's an integration for GoInstant. And in case you're not familiar with GoInstant, GoInstant's backend is a service that's based out of Halifax. And this exposed me to a lot of the internals of Angular, which at the time were pretty ugly. But yeah, I learned the hard way. So this part, we're going to kind of split this up into two parts. The first part, we're going to just talk about some introductory stuff, and then I'm going to show you what we're going to be building the next time we get together and chat. So in 25 of the most action-packed minutes of your life. Yeah, my wife is always telling me that I disappoint her whenever I say that. So we've got 5 reasons that you should be hacking on Angular. So the business case for using Angular to build applications. We're going to talk about all the different pieces and why they seem so unrelated to each other. And then I'm going to give you some kind of like pro tips, stuff to hold you over until we chat again. Good places to get started. So a few reasons, he's only got 4 fingers, but these are 5 reasons why you should hack on Angular. The first thing is test-driven development. Do you guys use test-driven development? Does anyone test their code? Nobody tests their code. You know, we pretty much always write tests now when we're building applications, and a framework isn't any good unless it helps you do the stuff that you do every day, both better and easier, makes it faster. So the Angular core team takes this very seriously. In fact, most of the guys on the Angular core team, before I jump into this, everyone knows what Angular is, right? It's a client-side JavaScript framework. Probably should have mentioned that earlier before we start talking about testing it. So they've actually started building tools to make testing Angular even easier. The entire framework is built from the ground up to make testing simple. And that's a pretty big deal, because if you try to use a framework and haven't thought about testing from the very inception, it's basically impossible to test. I mean, they leave it to you to figure out, and that really sucks. So they've actually built some tools. Karma is a test runner. It's not opinionated. You can use Mocha. I'm not sure what you guys use. What do you guys use to test internally? I'm not sure. Okay. But you mix of things. Mix of things, yeah. A mix of things / nothing most of the time is what we use too. So Karma is super useful. Actually, there's one more too called Protractor. When you guys use end-to-end tests, so it's like an audit. It basically automates your browsers through a bunch of the user's actions, and it's actually pretty tricky to set up even now. The core team now has 15 people on it, and one of those people is just building this end-to-end testing tool called Protractor, and we'll check that out in the next session. It is freaking awesome. I'm doing a project now in React, and they don't have an end-to-end testing tool, and it's a nightmare. So it's nice to have. Obviously, if you want to use a framework, you're using it so you have to write less code. You're going to write less code with Angular, no question of that. But you're also going to write less boilerplate. I think, you know, when we start to use these frameworks, a lot of the time, we copy and paste something like a model or a controller, the template for it. You know, it's all the different. It's an object with tons of parameters. It's basically configuration. You don't do that in Angular. You know, everything in Angular is just basic JavaScript. If you can write JavaScript, you can use Angular. So there's less boilerplate, and that's definitely by design. See, we're counting down here. This is very dramatic, building up the most important reason. So the architecture, it uses MVC. Are you guys familiar with like MVC, model view control? Okay, cool. So, I mean, this is a tried and tested approach to building user interfaces and applications. Came out in 38 years ago, Smalltalk 76, pretty old. And as a refresher, you basically have a user that's interacting with a view. That's about what the user's seeing. You have a controller. That's really about your application's behavior. That's where you describe what it needs to do. And then you have a model, and that's where all your application state lives. And state is the right word. We're going to come back to that the next time we get together. And then, of course, you have Angular's great claim to fame, data binding. Does anyone know what data binding is, or is anyone familiar with data binding? Okay. So it's pretty simple. It's synchronization between a view and a model. You have a template that is compiled into a view, so that's only going to happen once. And then you have this relationship that's established between your view and your model. When your model changes, when the state of your application changes, your view changes. And when your view changes, because the user is interacting with it, they're clicking on a button or something, your model changes, the state of your application changes. So the most important reason, the most important thing when you're picking a framework is always the community. Because when you're using an open source framework, the framework really is just the product of the community that's building it. It's a product of their opinions and the things that they like to do. So you look at Stack Overflow, there's 25,000 questions asked. At least 2 or 3 of those have answers. You've got AngularJS, the IRC channel. It is always chock full of people. Like, I would never have been able to build Go Angular. Go Angular was basically built by people in the IRC channel who just answered my questions over and over. And there's tons of people. I'm too lazy to count them, but there's a bunch of them. They just had their first full-fledged conference, and it was huge. I was lucky enough to attend it in January. And all of the videos from that conference are available online. They're totally free. You can check them out on YouTube. And they've got everything from introductions, like 10-minute introductions, a 30-minute introduction, and they've got everything up to like really complex introspections into how the dependency injection system works. And one of the core things in this community is that they don't, it is opinionated in terms of, like, they prescribe a suggested structure for your application, the way your folder should be laid out, and we'll come back to that in a little while. But if you're using JavaScript, it's because you like a language that is flexible, because let's face it, JavaScript isn't perfect. It's got its quirks. So that means, you like a quirky language. And Angular is kind of a quirky framework in that they don't tell you exactly what to do. So an example of that, they don't force you to wrap all of your modules, so plugins basically for Angular. They don't want you to do that. They don't want you to take something like Lodash. Is anyone familiar with Lodash _? Okay, cool. So they don't want you to take that and make it like Angular specific. They just want that's generic. Let everybody use that. If it's dependent on the core, so Angular is dependent on the core, it's very integrated into Angular, then yeah, for sure, make it an AngularJS module. But when you don't have to, don't do it, right? So they have a very kind of like open policy for that. And it's also built by Google, which is a really good thing for us. I mean, they sit like 3 doors down from the guys building the browser. So actually, this isn't really true because Facebook said it, and the guys over at Ever said it. So yeah, there's a few people who think they can build a better framework, but Google's doing a pretty good job. And this kind of proves it. I mean, you look at the separation between them and the rest of the pack. This is from January. Like, they're trampling the competition right now, and all of this stuff's adding up to that. Obviously, the blue line is Angular, otherwise it'd be a really stupid slide. So a few reasons that you should use it. You should use it because the community is large, it's active, it's friendly, it's very responsive. You should use it because of data binding, which eliminates a bunch of boilerplate. The architecture is well established. You're going to be familiar with it. It's going to make it easier to pick up and learn. And then, of course, this all adds up to you writing less code. And because the whole framework is built with testing in mind, it means you're going to write more apps, which is generally less suck, which is always a good thing. So how do you go about actually using Angular? Where do you start? Because there's so many things. You've got modules and directives and models, controllers, views, data binding, services, filters. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I think people kind of are, where do you begin with this? Like, where do you start when you want to build an application? And it can be pretty overwhelming. Not quite sure what's going on there. Got some sort of rainbow effect happening. But if you start at just the surface of your application, this is my email. You can see that it's quite easy to split up between all of Angular's features. You've got a few controllers; those are managing different parts of the view. You've got some filters, so a filter is another term. That's just changing what's actually displayed in the view, the data that's there. You have a directive up here in the corner. That's my little profile pic there. That's going to be shared across all of Google's applications, so it's repurposed, a repurposed element. So I've just got to do something about this rainbow effect happening. Everybody's going to be distracted. Bear with me. Total fail here.
What is that?
Oh, it's the title of the project. Why is this not showing up? Oh, where's it gone? My editor's disappeared. Let's reopen this. All right. So I think it might be this. It's rainbow time method.
It'd be rainbow time.
It'd be rainbow time. So, you know what? This is just jQuery. It's gross. We should just strip this all out and replace it with Angular. So let's do that. Everybody gets it now. I had one guy that was like, really going to do this right now? During the presentation? So my slides are powered by a framework called Reveal. And Reveal is just like a one-page app. And you can see that you've got these different slides. Each slide is a specific section. It's actually a really cool tool. And then some of these have a property called title. I think it's just data title, yeah, so you can see here. So we have a data title. Can everybody see that okay? So that's the property that is being assigned to the section on the bottom there. So this bad boy here, it's still going crazy. And I use live reload, so this is gonna change in real time as we start to adjust this. So what's the first thing we want to do? Well, I mean, first I guess I should point out that adding Angular to a project that's already in place is actually really easy, because Angular, when it loads, when it initializes, it scans through, it parses through your document, and it looks for a directive. This is kind of your first directive. And a directive tells Angular what type of behavior should take place. So the first directive we're going to use is ngapp. And ngapp basically says, hey, there is an Angular application, and it's responsible for this part of the DOM. So we're going to drop it in the HTML tag, but we could give this to a subsection of the DOM too. And Angular is only going to play in that small playground that we give it. So we should call this like Angular intro. And let's see if we can get the console to come up here. We've got a really informative Angular error here saying uncaught object. That's really useful. Angular's errors are sort of hit or miss. Some of them are really good, some of them are really bad. They've been going through and fixing a lot of them up. I guess it kind of maybe goes without saying, maybe I should mention it, that we do have the Angular library included in the script tag at the bottom. It's installed with Bower. So there's an interesting divergence that's happening in Angular where half of the community is running off with Browserify. Can you guys put your hands up if you know what Browserify is? No exclamation? Okay, a couple people. Okay, we'll come back to that and we'll talk a bit about it. And half of them are running off with Bower. I talked to the guys on the core Angular team, and they're pretty upset that they decided to run with Bower. Like, that's a decision they kind of regret. But I think that there is lots of value in using both. They're both different. They do different things, and there is a place for both of them. So we have the script tag down at the bottom here. We have ngapp at the top, and Angular's throwing an error because it can't actually find that introduction. So let's give it that. Oops, we're going to get rid of all this stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare a module. Now we could do like Angular intro. This is actually going to return the module. And it's got two modes. One of them is a getter, and one of them is a setter. So if I do Angular intro, you're going to see we have two errors at the bottom here in the console. Can you guys see that okay? I mean, it's kind of, maybe I should move it to the top of the screen. Can I move it to the top? I might have taken on too great a task here. This may or may not work. Wow. Okay. Look at that. Yeah, really though. So
we've got two errors. And the reason for that is that the getter is doing the exact same thing that the directive is doing. They're both calling the same method. They're both saying, hey, is there a module? If there is, go and get it for me. And a module is how Angular divides up its applications. And you might see in some of the old examples of Angular, they only have one module, but you'll see in the application that we start building together, you end up using tons and tons of submodules and so on and so forth. So how do we make this a setter rather than a getter? We just add dependencies. So this array would contain a set of dependencies, which would tell Angular that we need those things. I mean, is everyone familiar with dependency injection from one language or another? Okay, cool. So Angular simulates dependency injection, which creates a lot of problems, which we'll talk about how you overcome later. So now, if we come back to this, we can see that the error has gone away. That was very good of it. So the next thing we need to do, we need to use another directive. You can see that we have our section title. This is the part of the DOM that you see down at the bottom here. Very straightforward. We can get rid of this ID now because we don't need that anymore. We're using Angular. And we need to create a controller. So guess what a controller is? It's another directive. So directives sound like these, sort of intimidating things you've never heard of before, but yet really they're just attributes that you add to the elements that, as Angular parses over them, are associated with certain behavior. So let's create this. Let's call this section controller. Maybe we should, yes, that's fine. So we'll call this section controller. And now we can see that we have an error. This one's a lot more informative. It's telling us that there is not a function for that. And notice that it's looking for a function. So like if we just went section controller, that's it. So that's just a general JavaScript function that it's looking for. Now, you'll see this done sometimes. This isn't the way that you should define your modules. Generally, you won't return them unless you're using something like browserify, which again I'll show you later. But the way you'll see it kind of most commonly done now, and of course you can pick how you define them yourself, but you'll actually see it declared. The first argument is the name, and the next argument is going to be this function, which we can just copy and paste up here. Whoops. We'll get rid of that. Why not? And the behavior is going to be pretty much the same. It's not going to be pretty much the same. It should be exactly the same. So you can see control loading. So two different ways of defining it. They both do the exact same thing. And each one of these is going to return that module, so you can continue to chain them together. Okay, so what should we do next? Well, that's not very cool or very impressive. We should actually try to show a section title. So let's talk about data binding for a second. So the first thing that we need is a template, and the index.html is just, in this case, a template. So if we add handlebars template tags, or is anyone familiar with handlebars? Okay, so it doesn't use handlebars internally, but it is something like it. So we'll call this section.title. Another anti-pattern that you'll see sometimes used is you'll see, so for example, somebody will just assign a primitive value directly to a tag like this or a model. And that's kind of a bad practice, because if you end up adding another module and you need to access something in the parent, now you have no object to reference anymore. So you can't pull that primitive into the second level of the second depth of your controller. So you want to make sure that everything always has a dot before it. So let's declare that. We'll just create a little object. So scope is we're going to declare a dependency right now. So we're declaring a dependency on scope. So we're saying we need this to be brought in. Now there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use the extended syntax, which looks like this. So you pass into the controller an array. Now, like, this is pretty hideous, but it has some benefits. If you can imagine minifying this code, you can kind of guess that if Angular is able to look at it and understand which dependency this is, it's tokenizing that script. That's the only way it can do it. It has to look through it. It has to say, what are you looking for here? You're looking for scope. Okay, we'll go and find that for you in the dependency tree. So if this was minified, this might end up being something like this, and now that isn't very useful to Angular anymore. So this creates a problem, and we'll talk about how you can overcome that later. But for now, we're going to use what I believe is the more attractive syntax. And honestly, it's all about how your code looks, right? So we're going to create a section.title here, and I don't know, this is a title. I don't know why I decided to use it. So So this isn't working, and it isn't working for a reasonably good reason. So let's go look at our index for a second. We have our ng controller here. We have our section title, and now I'm gonna take this and just a sec here. Make sure that I'm actually using the same syntax in both. Okay, so now we want to do is we want to like dynamically assign that every time the slide changes. So you can see that like this is a title, but it isn't very useful because the event that's triggering it's never being called. So that's not good. We don't want to do that. And these double quotes are killing me, so I'm removing them. Alrighty. So we can see that. And we've got our section.title. We are going to want that. Ooh, uh-oh. So there you go. So it can't set the property title of undefined. That's the error that we're getting. And now we're going to just drop this out for a second. See if you guys can pick up on why this is not working. So we have this as a title. And the difference there is that it isn't, when you assign it to scope, it isn't being directly assigned to scope. Right? So you can't declare the variable and then pass it to scope. It needs to live on scope for its entire duration because they're the same object. So when it gets reassigned, it gets wiped. So it's a stupid little thing, but that's the way it goes. So the way you would do, because you'll see that a lot, people will first assign it to a var and then try to pass it in, and of course it doesn't work. And there we go. This should work now. Oh, why is it not working? Oh, thank you, Brandon. That was very helpful. There we go. You gotta forgive me. I'm still in vacation mode. I just spent 2 weeks down south. So, okay. So, but again, not very useful. So the next thing we're going to do, reveal has some events. I think I remember what they are. On slide change. Yeah. Let me get rid of this for a second. Well, let's pull up the reveal doc so I don't have to remember off the top of my head. So again, reveal.js is the framework that I'm using, and we're going to pull in an external library, and then we're going to use an event in that library to update the value of scope. And some people consider anything that you put on scope a model. I don't know if you guys have watched the YouTube video. That's one way to look at it. I think a model is a little bit more involved than that, but for the case of this presentation, that's kind of as far as we'll take it. Oh, we want reveal.js, I just don't want to guess at the GitHub. I think their docs are here. There we go. Where is it? There we go. So these are kind of all the events that we have access to. We've got get current slide. We're going to need that. So we'll use get current slide to grab the title. And we won't use jQuery. jQuery is on the page because Bootstrap depends on it, but otherwise we wouldn't have it at all. And we'll just use get attribute data title. That's one thing we need. And then the other thing we need is the on slide change, add event listener. There we go. We'll grab that. And we'll use the slide changed. So this is going to be called every time the slide changes. We'll update the title. All right. Guess we kind of want all this stuff in here now. Oh, I need this. All right. There we go. It's ugly, but it'll work. Okay, so let's just make sure that we're actually getting that title. Brain's moving kind of slow. We want to make sure it's actually working. Oh, we got syntax error. No, that shouldn't do it.
Oh yeah, that's not a function. Just delete line 9.
Pardon?
Delete line 9.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was me guessing. Thank you. Okay, so now every time we change it, you can see that the title is just being dropped into the console, but it's not actually being updated. Our template isn't actually being updated. So, any guesses? Anyone want to hazard a guess as to why that might be? It is being updated, so we've got scope.section.title here, and if we just copy and paste this right below it, you can see that it's actually working. So, like, we do have a title there.
You have to fire up the variable.
Ah, there you go. So yeah, that's like the most common. There's really only two ways you can do that. You either end up having to say, I've changed something, do something about it, or the way that Angular works is it creates this watch list. And every tick of the event loop, so JavaScript runs through an event loop, every tick of the event loop, it checks that watch list and it says, has anything changed? And if nothing's changed, it moves on. And if something's changed, then your DOM is updated to reflect that. So there's two ways of doing that. And you're going to need to do this whenever you do and you'll see this pops up on Stack Overflow like every third day. Somebody's like, hey, I updated it, nothing changes, what's the deal? And they usually get downvoted like crazy for that. So if we call scope.apply, so the scope API has this apply method which notifies Angular that something's changed. And we change the slide, so that event fires. You can see that now the title's been up to date, or is updated. And there's two ways you can do this. You can also add a function, and then we can drop that into drop that actual change into this function. And this is generally the preferred method because it wraps it in a try-catch block for you, which kind of gives you better error locality if things are changing asynchronously. It's just kind of a good practice. So now you can see that it's being updated when it changes. So these are kind of fairly small minor things, but we've just converted what was, I don't know, okay, I'll give it to you. 10 lines of that was about rainbows. Most of that was just about managing the DOM. The process that we go through every time we write code, where we say, this event occurs somewhere in my DOM, and I have to change my model. And then when the model changes, I need to change the way my DOM looks. So you just remove all that boilerplate, and it boils down to this. And you can kind of see that when something asynchronous is happening, you could do all of the processing behind the scenes and only apply that change once. And it becomes, let's touch on that point about including logic in the DOM. So Angular takes a lot of flack because some people that use it will add all of their business logic right to the DOM. But that's really not what it's for. The reason that you can include expressions, this is an expression in the DOM, is so you can do things like this. I mean, the original behavior here was when the slide didn't have a title, so it's null, it would go away, it would disappear. And the way that you can do that is just basically by saying ng-hide don't show if there's not a section title. So this is a minor thing, but it's not really about business logic. We're not changing the state of our application. We're just saying that if there isn't a section title, then don't display this part of the DOM. And that's how business logic should really be used in Angular. Or sorry, that's how logic in the template should be used in Angular. If it's business logic, it should be in your models. And we'll touch on that during the advanced stuff. So again, very, very straightforward. Now you can see that actually it's not disappearing because it's null. There you go. So that's kind of in 10 seconds, or I guess it was more than that, 25 minutes, almost 10 seconds, close. We just covered directives, controllers, Angular modules, dependency injection, all these big words that kind of get bantered around, but really aren't as complex as they sound. So let's flip back to this. Okay. Oh, we should actually make this the title. There we go. Okay. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. You can only watch me live code for too long before you just pass out from boredom. I know how it is. So here's a couple of things that you're going to run into that we'll discuss in more detail later, but some stuff that you're going to run into pretty much as soon as you start using Angular. You're going to want to put watch everywhere. Watch, again, is on the scope API, and all it does is notify you when the value you want changes. That's all watch does. But you're going to want to see them all over people's controllers. Don't use them in controllers wherever you can avoid it. You should be able to use template logic to show or hide things, and then logic in your directives to
change how your directive behaves based on the value of the model that's being passed to it. And again, that's kind of more advanced. We'll get into it later. UI router is basically just like won the battle for routing in Angular. I don't even know how they did it, but they did it. Nobody uses the default router anymore, and I'll kind of show you why. The UI router is a state-based router as well as a route-based router, which is really cool when you have lots of components on the page and all of those components have independent state. If you ever run into the problem where you're building an application, you have a route, but like some things, for example, the navigation, the behavior of your navigation changes separately to the behavior of the rest of your page. It needs to be managed independently. So that's where state really comes in handy. If you don't like the dependency, so this was the extended dependency injection. You can use the more terse format, so the second one I showed you. You just need to use ng-min handling the minification. This is another reason that you might want to use UI router. People have had problems with minification using the standard router. You want to use apply just to let Angular know, but you anytime your DOM, you're 100% sure your DOM should be updated, but it isn't. That's probably, you probably need to call apply. And you're going to run into this situation at one point or another where applies are being called in tandem. So you have these independent components, and they're both calling apply at the same time because they're both due to some event that you've got no control over, and it's going to tell you that there's already an apply happening. So you can look for safe apply, and I'll show you the script that I use when we build an application. You're going to want to break up your Angular application into components. So the original structure they had was like you have one folder that was controller. I mean, you guys have probably done this a million times. You've got one folder that's controllers, one folder that's views, one folder that's models, et cetera, et cetera. They kind of pushed that aside. They deprecated that. I'll show you the new proposed structure in just a minute. So if you want to find modules that are specific to Angular, they're all on ngmodules.org, and you can search them just like you would search Power. You shouldn't really need to use jQuery in Angular. I'm not saying you shouldn't have them both on the page, but I'm saying you shouldn't be manually managing your DOM while Angular is managing that same DOM. So you should invest in learning Angular. It's going to help you build applications faster. Obviously, you know that. You invite me out to chat about it. And if you break it down into little bits and pieces and you don't get overwhelmed by all of the terminology, they're actually really simple. So Angular's the shit. But I want to show you the application that we're going to build. I'm going to leave this up for a sec because we're going to come back to it. I want to show you the application that we're going to build in what might end up having to be kind of a bit more of a drawn-out session. I know that sounds exciting. So this inviting me out here kind of gave me this idea for an application that we might be able to build. I really like the idea that we're kind of sharing resources, and I thought it would be neat if we had kind of a dictionary of all the talks that people had proposed in maybe a given location. And we could say, well, Nicolas Cage, I think that's Nicolas Cage, he knows a lot about how to brush his hair, and he wants to give a talk on that. And we just happen to want somebody to come and do that, so let's see if he'll come and do it with us. So it'll give us an opportunity to kind of talk in depth about filters, how you'd implement search, how you handle navigation, how you handle routes in a single-page application. So we won't get into building it today because that would take hours, but I do kind of want to show you what the application structure is going to look like. Here it is. Okay, so we talked about the fact that you used to see this kind of classic separation between controllers and models, et cetera, et cetera.
Can you just pull no?
Oh, sure. Oh, that not work.
It's not projected.
There we go. Can you actually see it from where you're sitting there? Or maybe I'll make it. Maybe I should make it bigger. I don't know how to make the menu bigger, so that's not happening. Giving up on that idea right away. Yeah. So this is kind of what we're going to do. We're going to go through this application, and we're going to use a bunch of different tools. So as I mentioned, Browserify is kind of when this will actually make it easier to see the. There we go. I can blow this up.
Also cut off.
Oh, is it? Okay, let's move it over a bit. Okay. So it's broken down into components which contain your images, models, filters, etc., and subsections. So if you look at this Lunch and Learn, you'd have a subsection for talks. You'd have a subsection for events, perhaps, and I'll show you that in just a sec. Whoops. And maybe I'll just scroll down to the actual folder structure so you can kind of see how different it is. So you have, this is like a really basic application, and you have at the top level your app CSS, your app JS, your main controller, your main application controller, the controller that would be shared across your whole application, and then individual components. So all of the, so for example in this, your navigation is going to be a component. Back over. And then in a more advanced application, which we're going to try to make it semi-advanced, because I don't think you really learn a lot from building an application that isn't reasonably complex. You just don't encounter the same problems. So subsections. So again, that would be like talks. And if we look at our directory structure here, you can see that. Oh, sorry. This is need the other one. There we go. You can see that we have. At the top level, we have a client folder and a backend folder, and that's a backend, not a server. It's not an API. Those should be like completely separate. Maybe use token-based authentication. We can go through that. And then you have a components directory. So in this case, we have login, navigation, an individual talk. So that's like the model for the talk. And then you have the talks section, which has standard CRUD stuff. You add a talk. You look at the detail of a specific talk. You list a specific talk. And then each one of those has a module registration, and I kind of showed you what a really basic module registration looks like, and you can see in this we've got like subcategories. So we have the app module, the subsection module, and then the list module. So each of them is getting its own module, and of course being registered as a dependency. And then you have the entry point to all of this is your standard app.js file, which is in the top level of the repo or folder in this case, and you can see that all we're doing is requiring those components in and requiring talks. So this pretty much follows the prescribed structure, and what we'll do next time is we'll go through the application flow. The only thing I really want to touch on today is UI router, because that's the one thing that you guys won't find a lot of information on. So normally the way that you'll see that done is it's one configuration, a single app state file. So that's at the top level, and you'll call that like routes, but really it's states at this point. And if we and this is like a common folder, and the way that they prescribe it is either your lib or common folder. It's either under components as a lib or it's at the top level as common. And so we have an app state, and you can see that this takes in a couple of dependencies, same as before. And these dependencies are state provider and URL route provider, and I'm using the extended syntax to declare that I require those. And we've got two routes. We've got talks, which is this route, which is your main route, and then if you click new talk, it goes to talks/add. And the reason that UI router is so powerful is because you literally define it exactly as you list it. So we have a number of visual components on the page. We have the main component and navigation, and you can see that like the navigation isn't listed in its child, and you know it's a child because it uses dot notation, just like the files do, just like the components do, just like the modules do. So everything uses the same dot notation, everything uses the same module system, everything's defined the same way, and everything's in the same place. So you can find, you can understand your entire application flow just by looking at your app state, because you know all of the states that it's going to progress through. And that's kind of like one of the more powerful things about their new application structure. So we know that talks is at the top level under the talks URL or route. And then there's a second state, which is just talks.add, and this is relative, so this is talks/add. So pretty straightforward stuff, but it's going to be fun to go through and kind of map it out and show you how you can use. So like this is the index.html, and you can see we have vendor dependencies, which we're using Bower for, and I mentioned that like Angular has decided that Bower is going to be their go-to dependency system, which is crazy because that means that what they really want you to do is, so we've got all these components, and what they expect you to do is to build those components using something like gulp or grunt. But I mean, you can see that I'm using require, and kind of so is the rest of the community, because doing this is just so much easier, so much more fun than having to try to map all of that stuff out in a build, and every time you add something, having to add it to your build file. That's a nightmare, so we won't do that. But there is space for building all your vendor components into a single vendor.js. You see that done pretty commonly. And the last part of the routes is you can just see that they're declared with UI view versus ng route. That's the only difference. And you can see that this is the nav section, this is the main section. So in the actual common route states, you can see that we're just indicating that whatever this template is, which is going to be in the talks list.html file, is going to the main view, and likewise nav. So that's kind of what we're gonna hack on next time we get together, and we'll just walk through the entire application flow. And the stuff that you'll want to be semi-comfortable with between now and then are the new application structure, which you can. I mean, they just wrote a blog post on it, AngularJS style guide and best practices. Browserify, because did you guys follow any of the talks at JSConf last week? JSConf was like overwhelmingly about Browserify. I don't know how Browserify clean swept it, but they did. So Browserify seems to be coming out on top, and we'll go through why. And then there's a whole batch of resources. I strongly encourage you to check out JavaScript Jabber. I think JavaScript Jabber is like a really solid podcast. There's a brand new one which has Igor Minara, who from the Angular core team. He's the Angular team lead, and he talks about like why they built Angular in the first place, and goes through some of the same stuff we just did. Egghead.io is the reason that I won't show you individual snippets doing very specific things. That's all that website is he takes like a 3-minute video and shows you how to create a module, how to create a directive, how to create a controller, and how to use them. So that's a really good resource. Of course, you can go and check out AngularJS on Freenode. These are the core AngularJS videos, and these are all of the videos from ngConf. You can find this talk in my repo, and you can find the examples that I went through. One of them is listed under Intro 1, there's Intro 2, Intro 3, and the application we're going to build, it's private right now, I'll make it public and share it. This is a really crappy chat example, you shouldn't look at that, I don't know what to do with that. Questions? What a whirlwind tour.
What's the structure? I didn't see where you put filters, services, directives. Are those all within?
Yeah, so this I can make bigger, so we'll pull this up. See if they actually, do they show it? Yeah, they show it in this one. So you can kind of see that your components are, so your subsections are like the major parts of your site. So that's going to be your general create, read, update, delete, the list of things, etc. And then your components are stuff that's shared, but also stuff that is the dependencies of your subsection. So like subsection, in our case, it's going to be the list of talks, and one of the components will be a talk component, which includes the model, the filters, the directives for that talk, etc. So they're kind of end up being split. But it isn't uncommon to see a component with CSS, HTML, like it can be completely standalone, and a component can have subcomponents. So you can include all of the components that you're dependent on inside of your component. Not maybe the best way to do it, but.
So the component like a page? Like if you had a site with just a bunch of pages, how do you lay that out?
So like a component, if you're looking at this Lunch and Learn, a component is like a navigation. It's a shared thing that we're going to use across all of the pages, which has its own behaviors. And the actual talk model is a component, any kind of subset of your application. And there's two types of components in the Angular universe. There's vendor components and regular components. And you can kind of see them split up like in that index I showed you, where you can see like these are the vendor libraries, and they're issued separately because these are probably not going to change, and you're not worried about the errors that they generate, other than Angular, which obviously I haven't got the minified file there. So it's kind of nice to have those separated out, because those are going to be, you don't want to have to require those across every library when you're using Lodash everywhere. And then, of course, you've got the build app.js, and that's going to have references to all of your internal components. That make sense? Okay. I'll flip it back to the resources. So there we go. Oh, no, that's not resources. There we go. Any other questions? Did I address your logic in the template problems?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you don't see people doing that, really. You only see the behavior, like the actual, the behavior of the view defined in the template, nothing else. Any other questions? Anything you really need me to cover in sort of the second more advanced stuff? Anything that you really want me to go through, other than the entire application that we're going to build?
Does it do stuff like a backbone build where you can save a model to a server?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can do things like, because it's meant to be built on top of an API rather than just a server, you can include token authentication directly in the route. So you never actually have to deal with authenticating the token. You write a component that does it, and then you include that component once, and every one of your requests gets added to the headers.
Cool.
From a client or us, the end user perspective, for me to have access to resources that can build sites in Angular, is that giving us a better selling tool to clients? Are we giving them more dynamic sites with more functionality, with more wow factor? Or are we building more? I understand the efficiency side of things.
Yeah, so like efficiency and how quickly you build it. But you're going to maintain. So what is it like? What are the advantages from an end user's perspective?
Yeah.
You get an application that works. No, there's definitely advantages. When you have a framework that's built by somebody like Google, they're optimizing it always under the hood. So it's getting faster and faster and faster. And so, for example, in ES6, there's object.observe coming, which is going to make it much more performant. And that's going to be an enormous increase in performance, like in terms of the UI, that you don't have to pay anybody to build. So, and they have an evergreen project called Dart. So Dart is a language that they have internally at Google, and they have a completely separate build of Angular for Dart. And it's an evergreen product for them. They just constantly experiment in it, and then bring the best optimizations or biggest improvements back to the Angular core. So yeah, and they're all like 15 people. I think 14 of them are working on the second version of Angular. So arguably it's a good investment in terms of training people, because the new version is going to come out and be even better. Yeah. And then in terms of development efficiencies, you can't even compare them. Being able to modularize your code to this degree, and then one of the biggest problems when you're working on big projects, as you guys probably know, is dividing up the work in a manageable way, so you're not treading on each other's toes. And you can use version control, which makes it easier. But at the end of the day, if you have these really small components and you can dive into one small component and work on it, improve it, and then distribute that across all of the applications that use that shared code, that's a big advantage too. Any other questions?
I think for your next talk, I'd like to know more about directives and what logic should be in the directive versus the controller.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely going to be in there. Yeah, that's a big problem you see in a lot of applications, especially it really affects performance with large data sets, because they do so much of that logic in the controller, and then they need access to it somewhere else, so they make it global. Now every redraw is recalculating that entire data set. Yeah, where you put things on scope affects, because if you can picture that it's running through that cycle every time and checking to see everything that's changed, sometimes you don't want Angular to be aware of big changes. And that's hard to avoid if you can't remember all the places you dropped it on scope. So yeah, we can definitely get into that. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, guys. Oh, you got any questions?
I feel like you should go over here, just for getting started.
What's that?
What's the best way to get started?
Egghead. I would look at Egghead, and I would run through a couple of their tutorials. And then, honestly, we're going to build a whole application. That'll be good.